Before we delve into this story, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any investigations like this one. Turn on notifications and become part of our community. And feel free to comment on where you're watching from now, your city, your country. As you type, the story begins. The house had always stood there, imposing and silent, as if observing the world with cruel patience. Located on the outskirts of San Jose, the mansion rose with corridors that seemed to lead nowhere, staircases interrupted by the ceiling and doors that opened onto solid walls. For many, it was merely an architectural eccentricity inherited from an old fortune. Elliot Harrowit was the center of a discomfort he couldn't yet name. Elliot hadn't grown up surrounded by luxury. An investigative journalist, accustomed to dealing with forgotten files and stories no one else wanted to tell, he was drawn to the mansion after finding contradictory financial records linked to the Winchester family. Large donations, inheritances scattered among non-existent institutions, and a series of deaths officially classified as natural, but which followed an unsettling pattern. The money never disappeared. It just changed hands. On the other side of this story was Margaret Calloway. Margaret, the curator responsible for preserving the mansion and indirect heir to part of the fortune. Unlike Elliot, Margaret had grown up within the heavy silence of wealth. She had learned early on that questions came at a high price, and that certain doors, even when open, should not be crossed. Her official role was to keep the family memory alive. In practice, her role was to prevent that memory from being examined too deeply. The first confrontation between the two wasn't through words, but through actions. Elliot requested access to internal documents from the foundation that maintained the mansion. 2 days later, his request was denied without justification. That same week, a longtime employee of the Historical Archive resigned hastily. The following week, some of the digital records that Elliot had copied simply ceased to exist, as if they had never been created. Something there was reacting to the investigation. The mansion was not merely a symbol of eccentricity. Each expansion made over the years coincided with a loss: an heir who went mad, a spouse who suddenly fell ill, a financial manager who disappeared after a multi-million-dollar transfer. The fortune grew, while those involved dwindled. The house expanded as if fueled by something beyond money. Elliot noticed the pattern when he compared construction dates with death certificates. It wasn't a coincidence, it was a sequence. Margaret, for her part, felt the pressure mounting. Too many people were getting closer to what her family had spent decades burying beneath layers of architecture and convenient legends. She didn't believe in curses in the supernatural sense, but she knew that this wealth carried a real cost: psychological, physical, and social. Still, protecting the legacy was all she had left. Questioning it meant admitting that her entire life had been built on human ruins. Tension grew without direct confrontation. Invitations ignored. Phone calls unanswered. Doors that closed too early. The mansion seemed to respond to the atmosphere. More frequent creaking, areas cordoned off without explanation, alarms that went off for no apparent reason. Employees avoided certain corridors. Visitors reported feeling disoriented, even during guided tours. The mystery wasn't just in the past. It manifested itself in the present, shaping behaviors, decisions, and silences. When Elliot finally got permission to spend an entire night in the mansion under the pretext of producing a special report, Margaret agreed, against her own instincts. Perhaps it was an attempt to prove that there was nothing there but strange walls. Or perhaps it was the beginning of something she could no longer control. The house, motionless on the outside, seemed to have accepted the challenge. And at that moment, without either of them knowing, the first step had been taken to reveal not only a cursed inheritance, but the true price of wealth built upon carefully forgotten losses. The Winchester mansion was imposing not only because of its size, but also because of how it distorted the perception of those who entered. The corridors were too narrow for comfort, too wide to seem functional, Natural light rarely reached the back of the house, creating zones of permanent twilight even during the day. Elliot quickly realized that the environment influenced people's behavior. Employees spoke more quietly, visitors quickened their pace, and no one lingered too long in the same room without a clear reason. Margaret Calloway knew every nook and cranny of the building. She had grown up walking through those winding passageways, learning early on which areas to avoid and which doors never to open alone. Her relationship with the mansion was one of forced coexistence, not affection. To the public, she maintained the serene posture of a cultural guardian. Behind the scenes, she dealt with an administrative board obsessively concerned with the family's image and the continuity of tourist revenue. Among these advisors was Nathaniel Brooks. Nathaniel, the foundation's lawyer, was always impeccable and punctual. He had a specific talent, transforming ethical issues into contractual clauses. He was the one who blocked requests for access to documents, negotiated silent settlements, and decided how much of the past could be exposed without compromising the present. His motivation was not loyalty to the family, but the maintenance of a system that directly benefited him. Elliot began to carefully map these relationships. Instead of direct interviews, he observed patterns: who approved renovations, who signed off on payments, who left the mansion shortly before a suspicious death appeared in the records. Money flowed like an underground current, invisible on the surface, but crucial to everything that happened above. Early 20th century American culture emerged as an inevitable backdrop. The rise of industry, the cult of progress, and the belief that wealth was synonymous with virtue shaped the Winchester family's decisions. Donations to hospitals and churches coexisted with abusive contracts and mass layoffs. The mansion, in this context, was not merely a residence, but a private monument to excess, erected while the country rapidly transformed around it. Secondary characters began to gain relevance as Elliot deepened his investigation. Clara Monroe, the temporary archivist hired months earlier, displayed constant nervousness. She avoided certain boxes of documents and always turned off her computer before leaving, as if afraid of leaving something visible for too long. Thomas Reed, one of the oldest tour guides, he knew stories that weren't included in any official itinerary. He spoke little, but his pauses carried more meaning than his words. Margaret watched Elliot from a distance. She didn't see him as an immediate enemy, but as an unpredictable variable. Her own motivation was beginning to crumble. Protecting the family image was an inherited obligation, not a chosen one. At the same time, the clues Elliot raised touched on something she had always avoided confronting: the persistent feeling that the fortune had never truly been clean. The mansion reflected this conflict. Certain areas seemed to resist human presence, doors jammed for no apparent reason. Objects shifted after nightly cleaning. There were no official explanations for these phenomena, only internal records marked as structural occurrences. Still, the staff knew how to distinguish a technical problem from something that simply didn't want to be disturbed. Elliot came to understand that the mystery lay not only in isolated events, but in their normalization. What should have caused astonishment had become routine. The house had taught its inhabitants to accept discomfort as part of daily life, just as the family had learned to accept losses as inevitable costs of financial growth. Each character orbited the mansion for a distinct reason: fear, ambition, necessity, or inheritance, and all, without exception, were shaped by it. The architecture not only housed these people, it conditioned them. It influenced decisions, silenced questions, and reinforced the idea that certain truths were too dangerous to circulate freely. At the end of that observation period, Elliot realized that unraveling the curse of Winchester wealth would require more than documents or interviews. It would require breaking a silent pact maintained for generations, sustained by money, fear, and convenience. And the mansion, patient as always, seemed ready to test how far he was willing to go. Elliot's first night in the mansion marked a definitive shift in the tone of the investigation. There were no spectacular phenomena or obvious manifestations. What occurred was more subtle and, for that very reason, more disturbing. Records he had left neatly arranged on the table surfaced, mixed up the following morning. Nothing was missing. They had simply been rearranged in a way that was too logical, as if someone had understood exactly what he was looking for. Elliot didn't tell anyone what had happened. He preferred to observe. He began testing limits, leaving documents in different places around the house, changing schedules, changing internal routes. The pattern repeated itself. Everything remained intact, but always rearranged, discreetly corrected. The message was clear. He was being watched. On the administrative side, the pressure began to mount. Nathaniel Brooks called emergency meetings of the Foundation's board. Confidentiality agreements were reinstated. Employees received veiled warnings, and entire departments were placed under restricted access. There were no direct accusations, only a climate of constant surveillance. Each obstacle placed in Elliot's path made the investigation more urgent. Margaret felt the impact immediately. She found herself forced to choose between maintaining an appearance of neutrality or acting to contain the situation. She opted for silent containment. He authorized selective internal audits and allowed only edited versions of certain documents to be made available. It was an attempt to control the narrative without confronting it head-on. Meanwhile, Elliot pursued parallel paths. Outside the mansion, he encountered former contractors connected to the Winchester family, people who had participated in renovations, expansions, and restorations over the decades. Their accounts coincided on specific points: covered up workplace accidents, above-market payments conditioned on silence, and explicit orders not to record certain structural alterations in the official plans. One name began to come up frequently: Eleanor Whitcomb, the family's financial administrator in the final years of the last century. Officially, she had retired for health reasons. In practice, her name disappeared from the records soon after the mansion's major expansion. Elliot located an old address and decided to visit her. Eleanor's house was modest, almost inconspicuous in the neighborhood where it was located. The meeting was brief but decisive. She didn't talk about curses or ghosts. She talked about pressure, about decisions made in sequence, always justified as necessary. Each expansion of the mansion was approved after a significant financial or human loss. The money appeared to cover damages, compensation, or scandals. Never before. Upon returning, Elliot realized he was crossing an invisible line. His access to the mansion had been partially revoked under the pretext of urgent renovations. Some areas had become permanently off-limits. Tour guides had been instructed to accompany him on all his movements. The siege was no longer subtle. Thomas Reed, the veteran guide, began to openly avoid him, not out of hostility, but out of fear. In a rare moment of candor, he let slip that anyone who tries to understand too much ends up getting stuck here somehow. He didn't explain the meaning of the phrase. He didn't need to. The conflict ceased to be merely investigative and became personal. Elliot felt the atmosphere reacting to his presence. The mansion seemed to respond to his movements with minimal, almost imperceptible, but constant adjustments. Staircases led to different places than the day before. Doors he remembered being closed were open. There was no proof, only the persistent feeling that the space was being recalibrated. Margaret began to question her own choices. With each attempt to control the situation, something slipped through her fingers. For every document hidden, another surfaced. The balance that sustained her position was breaking down. She realized that the conflict could no longer be managed as an institutional problem. There was something structural, something deep, that reacted when provoked. The unfolding conflict revealed its true nature. It wasn't merely about exposing a compromising past, but about confronting a system that had learned to protect itself. The mansion, the foundation, and the fortune functioned as parts of the same organism. Attacking one meant provoking the others. And Elliot, aware of this, decided not to back down. He understood that from then on, every step would have a cost, and that the conflict would only end when someone was willing to pay it. As the central conflict intensified, smaller parallel stories began to intertwine, forming a web of silent tensions inside and outside the mansion. None of them diverted attention from what was at stake. On the contrary, each subplot functioned as a thread that, when pulled, tightened the main knot even further. Clara Monroe was the first to break the predictable pattern. The archivist began making unusual mistakes, cataloguing boxes out of order, leaving records incomplete, and requesting access to documents that were not part of her duties. Elliot realized that she was not seeking information out of curiosity, but out of necessity. In a brief meeting in the Foundation's parking lot, Clara made it clear that she had found something that shouldn't exist. A series of contractual addenda linking mansion renovations to confidential compensation funds, all activated after deaths or disappearances. This revelation introduced a new element: time. The funds were not permanent. They had short terms and were only accessed during specific windows, always close to tragic events. If Elliot lost momentum, the financial traces would disappear again. Meanwhile, Nathaniel Brooks was facing his own pressure. An old lawsuit filed years before had unexpectedly resurfaced. A former Foundation employee was claiming damages related to an accident that occurred during an interior renovation. The disturbing detail was the accident's location, a wing of the mansion that officially didn't exist in public records. Nathaniel mobilized resources to suppress the case, but each move increased the chance of exposure. Margaret, for her part, began to act outside of protocol. She visited areas of the mansion she had avoided for years, guided by a growing unease. On one of these forays, she found a sealed room that was not on any official floor plan. Inside, there were only marks on the floor and freshly painted walls, as if something had been hastily removed. The absence was more revealing than any object. Another subplot emerged involving Thomas Reed. The guide, pressured by changes in management, received a warning of imminent dismissal. His long stay at the mansion had made him inconvenient. In response, he began subtly altering the tour itineraries, inserting ambiguous comments, prolonged pauses, and unauthorized routes. He didn't tell complete stories, but planted seeds of doubt. The public left uneasy, and the Foundation began receiving complaints that were difficult to classify. The pressure of time became apparent when Elliot discovered that a major structural renovation was about to begin. The work would cover critical areas of the mansion, erasing physical and documentary evidence. He had only a few days to act before the past was literally cemented away. The subplots converged on a common point. Everyone involved was being pushed towards decisions that could no longer be postponed. Clara had to choose between handing over the documents or disappearing from the system. Nathaniel struggled to maintain legal control without exposing the Foundation's weaknesses too much. Thomas risked his stability to leave a mark. Margaret oscillated between the role of guardian and the impulse to break the cycle. Nothing there was free. Every choice had an immediate consequence, and none of them allowed for an easy return. The subplots didn't compete with each other. They reinforced the feeling of being trapped, that time was running out for everyone. The complexity of the narrative made it clear that the main conflict could not be resolved with a single, isolated revelation. An event would be needed to reorganize all these forces in direct conflict, and, silently, the mansion seemed to be preparing for it. The turning point didn't come as an explosion, but as a cold and inevitable revelation. The mansion's renovation began earlier than planned, encroaching on areas that hadn't yet been officially cleared. Fences appeared in the middle of the night, and entire corridors were closed off without warning. For Elliot, it became clear that this was the final attempt to bury physical evidence once and for all. He decided to act before it was too late. With the discreet help of Clara Monroe, Elliot gained access to an old Foundation server kept off the main network. The equipment stored not only financial documents, but also internal records of administrative decisions that had never been formalized. Among them, a set of reports marked Continuity of Assets Protocols. The content completely changed the understanding of the story. The reports described an institutionalized pattern. Whenever the fortune faced significant risk, lawsuits, financial crises, inheritance disputes, a set of measures was activated. These included the immediate reallocation of resources, emergency renovations to the mansion, and, in some cases, the silent replacement of people considered unstable or threats to continuity. The human losses were neither accidental nor mystical. They were calculated. The most disturbing revelation was in the signatures. They didn't just belong to longtime members of the Winchester family, but to contemporary trustees and administrators. The system wasn't a relic of the past. It was still active. Margaret confronted Elliot that same night inside the mansion, which was partially isolated by the construction work. There were no direct accusations. It was enough for him to show her the documents. For the first time, Margaret realized that she wasn't just an heiress protecting a problematic legacy. She was a functional cog in a machine that continued to sacrifice people in the name of financial stability. Her reaction wasn't one of theatrical shock, but of silent collapse. Everything she had believed to be tradition, precaution, or excessive zeal was revealing itself as unwitting complicity. The decisions she had signed, convinced they were administrative, had consequences she had chosen not to see. The unexpected event occurred a few hours later. Nathaniel Brooks suffered an accident inside the restricted wing of the mansion. Officially, a structural failure. Unofficially, no one could explain why he was there, nor why the access logs for that area had been erased. His death interrupted ongoing legal proceedings and stalled sensitive investigations. This event completely reorganized the landscape. The lawyer, who until then controlled the Foundation's legal workflow, had become just another name relegated to internal reports. The message was unequivocal. The system eliminated even its own operators when necessary. From that moment on, the mystery ceased to be a doubt and became an unsettling certainty. There was no supernatural curse haunting the mansion, but an institutional logic so cold and efficient that it mimicked the behavior of a living entity. The house didn't demand sacrifices, it made them possible. The turning point exposed the true antagonist, not a specific person, but a mechanism sustained by fear, money, and collective silence. Elliot understood that revealing the story would mean confronting not only the Foundation, but everyone who depended on it to keep their own truths intact. Margaret, now aware, found herself facing an irreversible choice. Continue feeding the system or destroy it, even if it meant losing everything that had defined her identity. Nothing could ever return to the previous equilibrium. The conflict had crossed the line from investigation to the realm of definitive consequences. The death of Nathaniel Brooks had an immediate and silent effect, like a stone thrown into deep waters. There were no official pronouncements beyond a brief statement from the Foundation, carefully worded to minimize questions. Even so, his absence reorganized hierarchies, disrupted decision-making processes, and exposed weaknesses that had previously been protected by his constant presence. Inside the mansion, the atmosphere changed. Employees began circulating in smaller groups, avoiding recently closed-off areas. Contradictory orders emerged daily, reflecting the internal struggle for administrative control. The renovation, previously planned as a continuous process, became erratic. Some wings were hastily demolished, while others remained untouched, as if no one wanted to take responsibility for moving forward. Elliot felt the impact directly. His access was drastically reduced, and his continued presence on the property was called into question. Instead of explicit confrontations, practical obstacles arose: delays in permits, equipment confiscated for verification, interviews cancelled at the last minute. The strategy was clear: to wear him down until he gave up. Margaret reacted in the opposite way. For the first time, she stopped acting as a mediator and began making decisions that destabilized the system itself. She temporarily suspended parts of the reform, demanded complete reports, and refused to sign new continuity protocols. These actions were not explicitly revolutionary, but they were enough to provoke immediate internal resistance. The Foundation responded with institutional pressure. Board members began to question his leadership abilities. Extraordinary meetings were called without his presence. Rumors about his emotional instability began to circulate, echoing exactly the criteria previously used to justify necessary removals. Clara Monroe disappeared from the administrative environment almost without warning. Her contract was abruptly terminated and her access to the systems revoked. Before leaving, she managed to give Elliot a partial copy of the most incriminating reports. There were no goodbyes, only the urgency to leave before it was too late. Thomas Reed suffered different but equally severe consequences. He was officially dismissed from his role as a guide, allegedly for violating visitation protocols. However, his departure caused discomfort among regular visitors, who began to question changes in the itineraries and tone of the tours. Small cracks were appearing in the official narrative of the mansion. The reactions weren't limited to people. The physical space seemed to respond to the institutional chaos. Alarms malfunctioned without any defined pattern. Parts of the mansion were reopened and closed on the same day. The atmosphere conveyed instability, reflecting the loss of human control over a system that had always functioned with precision. Elliot realized that the consequences were not only punitive but adaptive. The mechanism that sustained the fortune was reorganizing itself, seeking new forms of protection. The more resistance it encountered, the more impersonal and efficient it became. Politically isolated, Margaret began to understand the true cost of breaking with the legacy. Each step toward the truth distanced her from the structures that guaranteed her position. Yet, she did not back down. For the first time, her actions were not guided by the fear of losing her inheritance, but by the need to interrupt a cycle that she now saw with brutal clarity. The consequences had been unleashed. No character remained unscathed. And at the center of this controlled collapse, Elliot understood that the next move would require something more than exposure. It would require transformation. The next phase offered no relief. On the contrary, it imposed on Elliot a type of challenge that could not be faced with evidence or persistence alone. With the institutional net closing in, he realized that continuing to act as an external observer made him predictable and therefore disposable. If he wanted to move forward, he would need to change his own way of acting. Elliot abandoned the logic of linear investigation. Instead of seeking new information, he began to reorganize what he already possessed, connecting patterns of behavior to specific decisions. It was no longer about what was hidden, but about who reacted when something came to light. This change in posture marked his growth. He stopped chasing the system and began to provoke it. Margaret faced a similar, though more painful process. Isolated from the board, closely watched and threatened by internal audits, she had to confront her own identity. For the first time, She recognized that her authority came exclusively from the structure she was now trying to dismantle. Instead of seeking institutional validation, she began to act autonomously, taking risks she had never accepted before. This transformation manifested itself in concrete actions. Margaret authorized the release of areas of the mansion that had been hidden for decades, contradicting technical and legal opinions. She ordered the preservation of sectors threatened by the renovation, ensuring that physical evidence would not be destroyed. Each decision was an act of silent rupture. Elliot, for his part, began working outside the traditional press circuit. He shared parts of the investigation with independent researchers, historians, and cultural heritage experts. He wasn't seeking immediate publication, but redundancy. The more people knew, the less the system could erase. The character's growth wasn't accompanied by inspiring speeches or moments of sudden clarity. It was revealed in their persistence, in their refusal to return to their previous state, in their willingness to act even without guarantees of victory. New challenges quickly arose. The Foundation initiated a formal process to remove Margaret from her position, alleging breach of trust and institutional harm. At the same time, Elliot received legal notices threatening him with defamation and misuse of private information. These were attempts to push them back into the roles they had always played. None of them gave in. The mansion continued to exert its influence, but no longer completely dictated the pace. Small changes began to emerge. Employees questioned contradictory orders. Internal records were no longer updated with the same precision as before. The system, accustomed to automatic obedience, was beginning to fail. Overcoming the challenge didn't mean immediate victory, but active resistance. Elliot learned that exposing the truth wasn't just about revealing facts, but about enduring the consequences of that revelation. Margaret understood that breaking with the legacy required accepting the loss of everything it offered in exchange for silence. Both evolved not by becoming stronger, but by becoming less dependent on the structure that imprisoned them. And this internal change prepared the ground for the final confrontation that was approaching, inevitable and irreversible. Time ceased to be a backdrop and began to act as an active force. The Foundation announced an extraordinary assembly to deliberate on Margaret's definitive removal and the final approval of the structural reform. The vote would take place in a few days. After that, any remaining evidence would be legally considered lost or irrelevant. Elliot understood that this was the limit. There was no more room to accumulate information or prepare long-term strategies. Everything needed to converge into a single move, capable of exposing the mechanism before it could shield itself again. He focused his efforts on consolidating evidence. The reports delivered by Clara were cross-referenced with public records, archived court cases, and administrative decisions made shortly after deaths considered accidental. The pattern became undeniable. It wasn't necessary to prove individual malicious intent. It was enough to demonstrate the systematic repetition of decisions that always benefited the continuation of wealth after human losses. Margaret, aware of the assembly, made her own move. She used her remaining authority to convene an emergency technical visit to the mansion, involving external historical preservation agencies. The pretext was to assess structural risks before the renovation. In practice, this created a loophole. The presence of independent observers would hinder silent interventions and prevent the complete erasure of physical evidence. Tension grew within the mansion. Staff didn't know whom to obey. Orders were given and revoked on the same day. Some areas remained open for hours before being sealed again. The feeling was one of continuous instability, as if the space itself were on the verge of a definitive reorganization. Thomas Reed reappeared unexpectedly. Even though he was no longer in service, he handed Elliot a set of personal notes he had made over decades. They weren't formal evidence, but recurring observations. Renovations always preceded by tragedies, internal changes of course, after absences, people who disappeared from the corridors before disappearing from the records. It was the kind of material that, when contextualized, reinforced the narrative's coherence. The build-up to the climax involved neither fiery speeches nor grand alliances. It was marked by swift, silent, and irreversible choices. Elliot timed the gradual release of information to coincide with the assembly, ensuring that any attempt at silencing occurred under mounting public scrutiny. Margaret, for her part, accepted what she had previously avoided: the real possibility of losing everything. She didn't try to negotiate her continued employment or soften the accusations. She focused on ensuring the mechanism was exposed, even if it meant her definitive exclusion. The mansion, now surrounded by fences, technicians, and outside visitors, seemed cramped, less imposing, more vulnerable. Its corridors, once silent, echoed with too many footsteps. The absolute control it had exercised for decades was beginning to falter under the weight of the impending exposure. Everything was in place. The subplots had been resolved. The characters had made their choices. All that remained was the direct confrontation between the accumulated truth and the system that had survived for so long on the basis of silence. The day of the assembly began without any signs of abnormality. Clear skies, controlled traffic, the mansion surrounded by official vehicles and external representatives. Everything seemed too organized, as if the order were a desperate attempt to reaffirm control. Inside the main hall, the council members took their seats with calculated precision. Margaret sat alone, away from the central table, already aware that her presence there was merely ceremonial. Still, she remained motionless, observing. She wasn't seeking support, she was seeking the right moment. Elliot was not at the mansion. This absence was the first sign of a breakdown. As the assembly began, Elliot activated the plan he had been quietly preparing. The documents, reports, and decision-making patterns began to be released in a synchronized manner. Not as an isolated accusation, but as a logical sequence impossible to ignore. Universities, independent media outlets, historical preservation organizations, and investigative journalists received the material simultaneously. The story spread too quickly to be contained. In the meeting room, notifications began to appear on the council members' cell phones. Short messages, links, requests for their positions. The voting was interrupted for the first time in decades. The silence that settled in was not that of the mansion, but that of people realizing that control had slipped from their grasp. The decisive moment came when one of the external representatives requested immediate access to restricted areas, citing recently published evidence. It was no longer an administrative matter, but a public one. Denying access would mean confirming suspicions. Margaret then stood up. Without lengthy speeches or emotional appeals, she confirmed the existence of the asset continuity protocols. She assumed responsibility for keeping them active and declared that the system functioned at the cost of human losses treated as acceptable variables. Her transformation took place there. She ceased to be a guardian and became a witness. The turning point came next. An emergency inspection revealed that part of the mansion was structurally compromised due to successive and undocumented renovations. The risk of collapse was real. The house, a symbol of control and permanence, had become unstable due to the very logic that had sustained it. The attempt to continually expand and adapt the space had created irreversible weaknesses. The climax wasn't a physical explosion, but an institutional one. The assembly was suspended indefinitely. Federal agencies took over the investigation. The foundation lost autonomy over its property. What had survived for generations crumbled under the weight of its own efficiency. Elliot watched everything from a distance, not as a victor, but as a catalyst. He didn't destroy the system single-handedly. He merely exposed its gears to enough light to make them stop working. The protagonist's transformation was revealed in the final silence. He sought neither recognition nor control of the narrative. He accepted that the truth, once revealed, would follow unpredictable paths. The mansion, now surrounded by police tape and technical teams, remained standing, but devoid of power. The climax brought the central conflict to a unique conclusion, not with immediate punishment or symbolic justice, but with the definitive loss of that which had always sustained the curse, the secret. The weeks that followed the assembly brought no quick answers, only irreversible changes. The mansion remained closed to the public, surrounded by technical and legal investigations that accumulated slowly, but without interruption. The place that for decades had symbolized eccentricity and mystery came to represent something more unsettling: the materialization of a system that had prospered at the cost of well-managed silences. The Winchester Foundation was gradually dismantled. Its contracts were suspended, its boards dissolved, and its autonomy replaced by external committees. No single culprit was immediately identified. Instead, it became clear that the chain of responsibility was too long to be summarized in a single name or position. Responsibility was diluted among technical decisions, routine signatures, and justifications that were always too plausible. Margaret Calloway officially lost her position. There was no resistance or attempts at public rehabilitation. She left the mansion without final speeches, carrying only personal files and the clear awareness that her former life could not be recovered. In the following months, she began to formally collaborate with the investigations, providing context, documents, and explanations that only someone from the inside could offer. Her journey did not end in acquittal, but in a definitive break with the legacy that had defined her. Elliot returned to the relative anonymity that had always accompanied his work. The story was published, debated, contested, and analyzed from multiple angles. Some tried to reduce everything to administrative negligence, others insisted on more appealing supernatural narratives. Elliot did not engage in these disputes. His objective had been achieved the moment the system ceased to operate as before. The long-term consequences began to reveal themselves slowly. Old cases were reopened. Families received information they never imagined existed. Some answers brought relief, others only new questions. The truth did not offer universal comfort, but it broke the cycle of harm. The mansion, now silent in a different way, remained like a functionless body. Its excessive expansions, once a sign of power, had become physical proof of decisions made without limits. The space continued to exist, but its influence had been neutralized. In the end, the Winchester curse of wealth didn't reveal itself as something supernatural, but as a human pattern repeated until it became invisible. When exposed, it didn't implode in an instant. It simply ceased to sustain itself. And that was enough. Years later, the mansion remained closed, shrouded in scaffolding and technical reports that never reached a definitive conclusion. Architecture students analyzed its corridors as a warning, not out of curiosity. The place had become a study of excess, not of mystery. Margaret Calloway lived far from California, with no ties to foundations or boards. Her name appeared only in footnotes of historical research, always associated with the turning point that interrupted a cycle too old to remain intact. Elliot Harrow continued working, now with less access and more caution. He wasn't looking for new curses. He simply focused on recognizing patterns before they became too permanent to break. The mansion wasn't destroyed, it was emptied, and deprived of the silence that nourished it, it never grew again. Stories like this exist not only to be read, but to be questioned. The curse of Winchester's wealth is not based on the supernatural, but on human decisions repeated until they seem normal. How many similar structures continue to operate around us, protected by silence, convenience, or the fear of looking deeper? If this narrative has provoked unease, share your reflections. What struck you most? The mansion, the system, or the people who kept it running for so long? Do you believe that the truth always sets you free, or does it merely shift the burden to other hands? Comment, discuss, and take this story forward. Because cycles are only broken when someone is willing to see them and talk about them.